of my favorite professors at the University of Pennsylvania way back in the 19th century. And he's aged well. I've done less well. Charles wrote a paper in this last year about fiscal dominance, which is something I think that is very present in many of our minds. We'll be on the crypto panel right after this, and I'm sure discussions of fiscal dominance will pop in there as well. Charles' paper was very influential, extremely well read, but is part actually of a process that he's entered into, and I was unaware that he had left Columbia University and has started a new finance research institute. And so maybe that's a great place to start for a second, is for you to very briefly introduce what you're doing at your new research institute.
Thanks for giving me a chance to do that.
No, of course.
So, as I tell people, you've all seen on television some things that are going on at Columbia University. But what you don't see, which I do see, is how much the change in the university atmosphere really over the last, I would say, 12, 13 years has affected research and teaching. And I think I won't speak for Robert Barrow at Harvard, but I think, let's just say, we have similar conclusions about that. And we feel like important policy relevant economics needs to be brought back into center stage, and especially needs to be happening in Washington, D.C. So we went around, shopped the idea around, and we look like we have some initial support. We're hoping we're going to get some more support. And we're going to build starting on Friday, we'll have the best seminar in Washington, we think. It's starting up a monthly seminar to do that. We'll have a blog that he and I are going to co-write, and we're going to have a working paper series. We're going to have some other activities. So if any of you likes that idea, talk to me.
Well, I now know what I will be doing on Fridays. And Christian Parenti, I know you less well, but I was blown away by your book on Radical Hamilton, on Alexander Hamilton, and rethinking a lot of the stories that we have about Alexander Hamilton, the founder. Your work, I'd mentioned this to you before, is part of a growing body of historical knowledge, or historical reassessment of knowledge, I would say, that is rethinking Hamilton, not in the context of wonderful songwriting, but in the context of the actual economic policies that helped lift America out of what was an incredibly depressed period in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. Mm-hmm. And so you're a professor at John Jay College. You're not in finance.
Correct.
Although clearly your work has implications for finance. Maybe you could take 3 seconds, a little more than that, obviously, to introduce yourself, what you do at John Jay, and what brought you to write on Radical Hamilton.
Okay, yeah. So I teach in the economics program at John Jay, but I'm trained as a sociologist, and what I teach mostly is economic history. And by the way, we have an interesting master's program. If you know any young people looking for a good master's program in New York, please send them our way to check it out. I got interested in Hamilton because I read the Ron Chernow biography, which I think is how Lin-Manuel Miranda got interested in it. And there was this mention of the report on the subject of manufacturers, and I wanted to learn more about it. And so I scoured the literature on Hamilton and realized that it wasn't discussed very much, and that it was also misrepresented. And this struck me as actually pretty important. And so that's what the book evolved out of, trying to answer my own questions about Hamilton's thought and policy actions around manufacturing.
So it very much felt that way, by the way. It's a fantastic book, because they're available outside, and I'm sure you'd be happy to sign a few as people finish up. But the book does read very much as a process of discovery of what Hamilton stood for, right? And I think the vast majority of us imagine Hamilton as effectively an Ayn Rand type figure, all about, let's make sure that, competition is created and enforced, and every man for himself as we go forward with this. Reasonable interpretation?
I mean, that's a reasonable misinterpretation. I mean, that's the standard reading of him. But yeah, I mean, what he did was, when he ends up on Washington's staff during the war, and he gets a view of how chaotic and dysfunctional the war effort is, and also how important manufacturing and material reality is. And he has some sort of crisis in the winter of '77 when they're headed to Valley Forge. And before that, he wrote kind of like everybody else. But after that, where he's laid up for 2 months, he starts writing these letters to important people, one of whom his father-in-law to be later, laying out for the first time the whole idea of the new Constitution, because the U.S. at that time, or the rebel colonies, were operating with the Articles of Confederation, which was basically just a defense pact with Congress that had no powers of taxation. And so Hamilton, from the midst of the war, starts laying out and arguing in letters to important politicians and financiers his vision of what needs to happen, which is to create a strong government and then to use that government to industrialize. They don't use that term. Hamilton refers to it as manufactures. And his fundamental concern was geostrategic. He realized that if the U.S. remained as an agricultural dependent economy, that it would pretty quickly be reinvaded and conquered. The world at that time was full of large empires, not just the British, right? And so he set out to accomplish that, and he did. And I could go on and on about that, but that's the essence of the book. And the book is, as you say, it's Hamilton's discovery of this. Much of it coming from his reading. He read Smith, but also his experience of the war effort.
So one of the things that came out of your book for me that was actually super interesting, and I have to confess I had not considered it prior, was effectively the post-Hamilton era, right? So 1805 on under the administrations of Jefferson and then ultimately under Madison, you highlighted the deindustrialization process that actually began then and the contributions that made to the American defeat in the War of 1812. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, Jefferson comes in what's called the Revolution of 1800, and he abolishes all internal taxes. These taxes are often portrayed as very regressive, and this liberates the people from these onerous taxes, but they were actually progressive. Carriages, houses were also taxed. It wasn't just playing cards and newspapers. The revenue of the state, of the federal government, shrinks dramatically. Jefferson also buys the Louisiana Purchase, so a lot of money goes to that. And the Navy begins to contract radically. British naval ships start stopping and boarding American ships and seizing sailors, claiming that they're runaway British sailors. They then start landing and demanding produce, and the American people are getting increasingly frustrated by this. And eventually, war happens, and Madison declares war, and the British, you may recall, invade D.C., burn Congress to the ground, and burn the White House to the ground. And Madison and the entire government flee. So the British could have had their way with this country, but luckily they were too exhausted from too much fighting, and so they didn't attempt to reconquer the U.S. And then it's after that that Andrew Jackson has his victory, and we remember the War of 1812 totally incorrectly. And one of the things that is interesting about the effects of the War of 1812 are that Madison and the followers of Jefferson, who had disavowed Hamilton's interventionist focus on creating a manufacturing economy, are forced to actually return to a lot of those policies, because the solution to the crisis that they had created required that they actually follow the ideas of this guy that they had been so hostile to. I mean, they didn't acknowledge that that's what they were doing, but that's what's happening. They reestablished the Bank of the United States. There's the first Bank of the United States that Hamilton does enormous amounts to get established, is only chartered for 20 years, and it's allowed by the Jeffersonians to go out of existence. And after the War of 1812, it's realized, okay, we actually need a central bank. As Adam Smith said, when war comes, every state, even states with good credit, have to borrow a lot, because you have to suddenly expand your industrial capacity. You've got to build forts, you've got to build weapons, et cetera. So you need the mechanism to do that. So they begrudgingly reestablish the Bank of America. Well, not the Bank of America, but the precursor to the Fed. I mean, way precursor. It's the second Bank of the United States.
So this overlaps actually with the courses that I took with Charles Calomiris, and I remember them way too well. But a lot of the work that you taught in the finance courses that I had with you on financial systems and historical financial systems were about monetary systems, right? And the dynamics of monetary systems, everything ranging from cowrie shells, counterfeited to be dyed black. See, I did pay attention. And to the developments under Hamilton and the early stages of the U.S. Constitution and the development of the financial system and treasury of the United States. We didn't have a Federal Reserve at that point. As Christian points out, we had a Bank of the United States. Your paper looks at the modern era and says, we face a real choice here. If we're not very careful, we're going to end up in fiscal dominance. What does fiscal dominance mean?
It means that your fiscal decisions will dominate your monetary decisions. It means that you're used to having a Federal Reserve that's making monetary policy decisions, but it's possible that that will end, that the Federal Reserve won't be able to make monetary decisions because its only role will be to buy government debt because no one else would.
So one of the lines that we've heard in the past couple of years from the Federal Reserve is something I'd never heard them explicitly refer to before. Jay Powell said, we are the fiscal agent of the United States. And effectively what you're saying is that in addition to the dual mandate of maximum employment and stable prices, that fiscal agent can actually become the dominant feature, right, and you effectively just become a banker who has to accommodate your client.
Well, it happened during World War II. And then in 1951, there was this Treasury-Fed Accord. And the whole point of the accord was to end the business of the Fed shaping its interest rate policy at the behest of the Treasury. So from 1951 on, we think that we're reestablishing really an independent monetary policy. But that is not, that's something that's contingent. It's fiscally contingent. And now we're living through, of course, a period unlike any other period in U.S. history, but I don't want to jump ahead.
Well, I'm trying to actually blend you forth and back, right? But so if I think about the period that Christian is focused on, it's tough to imagine the U.S. being in a worse position than having just won a revolutionary war, not having powers of taxation to any real degree, relying on states to basically voluntarily remit resources to the federal government. Requires a radical reinvention.
Hamilton invented from scratch. We were worse than a banana republic. We were in default on our debt. Our debts were not denominated in our own currency because we didn't have a currency. We didn't have any, as you said, tax power. The Virginians had paid their state debts because they were the wealthy people in the U.S. at that time. And they weren't very interested in sharing burdens beyond that. And that's how we got our capital in Washington, D.C., of course. But the point is, it's more than that. It's setting up a funding system of how you're going to issue debt and then redeem it. Everything he did, establishing a new numeraire, the dollar, so that you could issue debt in your own currency, rescheduling the existing debts. And by the way, this is a moment to reflect, defaulting on our debts. We did default. So the rescheduling was a default. We didn't pay the present value of our outstanding debt. We paid less. And furthermore, on some of our debts, the paper currency that had been issued, we only redeemed it at 1/100th of its face value. So Hamilton was a practical person. I would call him a bold pragmatist. And you know, he was very concerned about reputation, but he was really, you know, in a difficult situation. And he somehow managed through this creation of revenues and all these other things to get things to happen. In comparison, our current lift is trivial. However, there's a difference. So you posed the question for me in this session, what would our founders do if they were confronted with this problem? So I had a seance actually with the founders. Each of them individually, I polled them. And you'd be surprised. All but one of them said, I would do exactly the same thing I did last time. And I said, really? They said, yes. Just give the job to Alexander Hamilton. And then I had the seance with Hamilton. He said, well, of course, completely different, but a lot easier. And I can talk about what that would be. But the problem is, there's no one to defer to right now. We are so divided politically that a rational solution is beyond us to a problem that's much smaller. I'm not saying it's trivial. And I just want to emphasize, in case you haven't followed it, our Secretary of the Treasury has publicly admitted that we're on an unsustainable or exploding path Just to give you a sense of it, when your government debt to GDP is at 100%, so the real growth of your economy, I'm going to say is, let's be optimistic and say 2% long term. That means that if interest rates in real terms were 2%, were a little more than 2%, the debt to GDP ratio would go to infinity. Of course, it's much worse than that because the deficit's growing and real interest rates are rising. And by our own Treasury's forecast, they're forecasting by the end of this century a debt to GDP ratio of 600%. Now, we're never going to get there, and they know that because the bond vigilantes will wake up long before 600%. And so we're sitting here in a country, by the way, how many of you saw the presidential debates and the vice presidential debate? There's no discussion of this, right? Why? Because we're so divided that it's not a topic that anybody knows how to touch.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. The irony, of course, is that barring Alexander Hamilton's recreation or reincarnation through a seance, it does feel like there is nobody of authority to help us navigate through this process. But as you point out, like I would encourage people to do this. Go online. There's any number of calculators on how you can solve the national debt. And it's actually really easily solved, right? It's a modest increase in taxation and a modest change in a few other policies. And it's solved, but nobody wants to discuss it.
Exactly. I mean, to her credit, Nikki Haley did. And you see where it got her.
Right.
So, there's it's a technical issue. People's eyes, I guess, glaze over when you start talking about it. But of course, it's much bigger than that. And so, I'd be happy to talk to you about. I agree with you. It's not that hard to solve, especially if you use a combination of things. And that's what Hamilton would have done, right? He would have, instead of saying, I'll solve it with one big idea, well, do 5 or 6 different things, all that complement each other and that make the adjustment problems on the margin easier for each of them. And I think, the interesting question, of course, is how are we going to solve it? Because all arithmetic problems get solved by some kind of choice, by some sequence of events. And so in my article that you kindly referenced, I tried to help people think through what is that sequence? Where will the choices become apparent? When will the politicians actually have to sit down? And, I want to just remind everyone, in 1893, we had a special session of Congress to deal with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and to repeal it. So why did that happen? Because financial markets were in turmoil because of the implications, the long-run implications of a policy finally became pressing. So I think that's the kind of way I would think about this, that there's going to be a failed Treasury auction, which is hard for us to imagine what that means, but there will be. There was one, for example, in December 1861 that is you
guys remember that, right?
I wasn't there, but I think you said you were.
Yeah.
But, and so this is how we have to learn to think. We have to think, okay, what's a precipitating event that will wake up the bond vigilantes? How long will it go before we get something that's a precipitating event? How will that affect the Treasury auction? How will the Federal Reserve respond to that? And then how will Congress respond to it? And in my article, my biggest concern is that there is a path of least resistance that leads to not a real solution, but a really bad one, which is to tax the banking system to solve the problem by getting rid of interest on reserves and imposing a high reserve requirement. And so instead of having, I know this sounds hard to believe, a 35 or 40% annual inflation rate, if you don't do that and you don't fix the fiscal problem, you would have maybe about a 10% annual inflation rate if you tax the banking system by reimposing very large zero-interest reserve requirements. So if Congress can't reach agreement, the Federal Reserve Board can do that. It has the authority to raise reserve requirements and to stop paying interest on them. That's the path of least resistance for political stalemate. So if you're a banker, think about that.
Well, this is one of the things that so to me, part of what's so interesting about articles like the one that you wrote, right, is that you had a combination of deep scholarship and proposals and suggestions and the math behind it. And basically the entire headline was, the US is in fiscal dominance and therefore we're gonna have inflation, with almost no actual discussion of the policies, et cetera. Did I miss that, or did that actually happen?
No, I talked about the fact that there'd be this choice between taxing the banking system.
No, I read the paper. I'm aware you talked about it.
Oh.
In the reaction, in the appearances that you made after the paper and the discussions, were there discussions around the substantive steering away from this event, which I think you and I would both agree, if you took active measures soon, is eminently avoidable?
Yeah, I think that everyone is kind of having the same feeling that we probably have, which is we don't know who to talk to. We don't have a Hamilton. We don't have an agreement. By the way, of course, half the founders didn't like Alexander Hamilton. By the way, John Adams
One of them
and he
shot
didn't
him.
get along very well, right? But they still knew that he was the guy. Robert Morris, who was kind of the guy before Hamilton, actually pointed to him and said, he's now the guy.
Yeah.
Ben Franklin was no slouch on finance, by the way.
He was also old, very old at that point.
But he also knew. So, but we just don't have that. And it's not just that we don't have a great personality, a genius. I'm sure we do. We have a lot of them. But we don't have the agreement that we want to solve this problem. But we will get there. And that's the interesting thing for us to think about as a matter of political science, or sociology, really, is how will we
Perfect.
react?
That's exactly the transition I would have made, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what has to happen also is a reindustrialization of the United States, right? We have seen the effects of deindustrialization. There's currently an ammunition shortage for the war in Ukraine. It's not a war I support. I hope Trump, if elected, does end it. But it should focus the mind that the U.S. deindustrialized much of its ammunition production. There was a big article in Reuters about this, how there's one factory left that makes TNT for the military, and it's full of guys in their 60s, right? And so now the political and military agenda of the state is constrained by the fact that economic rationality meant, you can more profitably and more cheaply make TNT and this ammunition in Russia and China. Well, surprise, surprise, there's problems with that. We had shortages of PPE during the pandemic. Luckily, a bunch of American firms rose to the occasion. But we have any number of problems like this. We have half of our aircraft carriers are not really fit for battle because there's not enough maintenance being done on them. So throughout the economy, we're seeing that there are very severe problems that come with deindustrialization, and we have to reindustrialize. We have to, not entirely, not close ourselves off from the world, but we do have to start making more things in this country for the economy to be healthy and for us to not just, pay the bills by printing debt.
So you brought up tariffs, which is something that Scott Besson, who was up here with me before, talked extensively about, and I wish you'd had the chance to hear it. We've largely been taught in this generation that tariffs are the sine qua non of, communism and socialism and all the terrible isms that exist out there. How would Hamilton have thought about tariffs, Christian?
Well, he thought about it in a pretty nuanced fashion in his report on the subject of manufacturers, which is, really his magnum opus. He lays out what he calls the means proper, which includes tariffs, but then also what he calls drawbacks, which is, gaps in the tariff wall for strategic items. Also premiums, which are subsidies targeted to specific technologies, specific firms. So tariffs have to be used carefully as part of a larger plan. They can't just, they're not a cure-all. They can't just be thrown around. They've got to be part of something larger that focuses on what sectors of the economy, or what types of technology do we want to industrialize. And we see, I think one of the most interesting things that happened in the transition from Trump to Biden was how Biden didn't get rid of most of Trump's tariffs, right? And we're seeing the problems of deindustrialization, how tricky it is in the CHIPS Act. It's not as simple as throwing money at the problem, right? The laundry system for the chip infrastructure in Taiwan is itself super high tech, and nobody here knows how to do it, right? So, I think one of the problems that comes from industrialization that we're currently facing is what it does to human capital and skills, right? For 20 years now, we've been told there's going to be an atomic renaissance. George Bush was talking about this, and there hasn't really been, despite lots of money being on the table, lots of subsidies being on the table to build new atomic power plants. One of the problems is that we don't have the engineering capacities, right? Our universities are not in the top 10 on engineering. Our universities are in the top 10 and top 20 in law, psychology, IT, entertainment, but metallurgy, mining engineering, these kinds of things, we don't make the ranking, right? So we have a big task ahead of us that I think to some extent is also cultural. Like we have to see the broad importance of industry and skill and self-reliance, and it is no longer sufficient to say, well, it could be more cheaply done abroad and then imported. For certain objects, yeah, fine, make Christmas ornaments abroad, but like other lines of production have importance that go beyond the question of prices and profitability. They strike at the heart of national security and what Hamilton and what the Constitution called the general welfare, right? Congress under Article 1, Section 8 has the right to tax and spend in the interest of national defense and the general welfare, which when Jefferson came back from France, he was like, the general welfare. He's like, that could mean anything. And Hamilton and his allies were like, yeah, well, that was the intention. We want the power. We want the government to have broad powers to direct the economy.
So one of the things, Charles, that you referred to when you were talking about, and I guess Christian as well, when you were talking about the empires that existed abroad, right? When you think about what it means to be a true fiat issuer, that's one that is paying its debt in its own currency. It's not constrained in the normal form, effectively, by the fiscal component to it. If it needs money, it can theoretically print it into an existence and spend it, and that can have inflationary consequences. But if you cross over into that fiscal dominance, that changes in a pretty meaningful way, right?
And inflation is not an infinite real tax. There's an upper bound on how much real spending the government can get from inflation. So I just want to emphasize, it's not just because you run the printing press that you can have a nominal inflation that's infinite, but that doesn't give you purchasing power of infinite amount. Yes, so it does change everything. I just want to go back to the tariffs before we move on.
Yeah, please.
So, what's interesting to realize is Hamilton's proposals for tariffs were not the reason that we actually got tariffs. We got some for revenue purposes. But the reason we got our first protective tariff was something else you referenced, which was once we went to war against Britain, we were we were in a trade embargo and then at war, which meant that we didn't have any textile or other kinds of manufacturing that we could import. Mm-hmm. And once the war was over, that went a long time. I guess it was about almost a decade where there was no imports. Once that war was over, we became flooded with those imports. Yep. And it was the people who had started new businesses who were now threatened that were the ones who got the protective tariff going. So I think it's important to kind of recognize there's a long history of kind of businesses lobbying the government for tariffs. I don't think that's where we are right now, though. I understand the attraction. By the way, I really agree with what Christian said about I want all those things to happen, but we have to be very careful about our tariff policy. And I liked what Scott said earlier about how tariffs don't necessarily all translate one for one into price increases. They can be used strategically. I think that's all true. But most of us who took international trade can remember Smith and Ricardo talking about it. Yep. But all of their examples, what were they? They were final goods imports and exports,
Yes.
right? Wine and wheat. That's not the world we live in. The world we live in right now is that for the past 30 years, the primary use of imports and exports is a supply chain of intermediate goods that is powering the multinational firms that are headquartered in the US that are contributing more to employment and to productivity growth than any other group of people in the US. So we have to be careful. Tariffs, we're not in the wine and wheat world. We're in the supply chain world. And the biggest growth in employment and productivity is knowing how to use that supply chain. And if you just decide that you're going to restrict imports, you actually are really damaging your own productive capabilities. So, and I know some people talking about this and then say, well, we'll exempt intermediate goods and all the rest of it. But I think that they haven't really looked at the numbers to see how big that is and to consider it. So I think that a lot of the discussion needs to remember that trade has changed and it serves this huge productive role.
So the first, I absolutely agree with that. I think that's actually a very important point. But the other factor I guess I would introduce along those lines is this issue of negotiating tactics that Scott brought up, right? This escalate to de-escalate, that we don't want to do this, but ultimately you've left us no choice. There's, that's another way of thinking about tariffs, right? They're effectively a form of strategic negotiation. Do you see a role there, and how did Scott's proposal sound?
But, again, one thing that was frustrating to me, so I'm a complete believer in strategic disengagement from China for geopolitical reasons. But then if that's what you're thinking, then you want to build alliances with Western Europe. You don't want to do something that's too across the boards. So I feel like if really, we've got to get our priorities straight. Are we really thinking of tariffs primarily as a geopolitical tool?
Or as a revenue tool?
Or are we thinking of them as revenue or something else? And I think we have to get our story straight. And I'm just not impressed by the discussion we're having right now. Let's just leave it there.
Yeah. They're an emotive, issue, right? And they're shorthand for we're going to do something about it. But yeah, clearly it's a blunt tool. It can be a very important blunt tool, but it's not sufficient. There's got to be concern. There's got to be a strategy for marshaling private and public investment into strategic industries. And for that to happen, there has to be a conversation society-wide about reindustrialization, what that means, how skills are built, what it is we're trying to achieve and why. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we're not having that conversation. It's just, it is an election year, and so that kind of has a crushing effect on intellectual content, unfortunately.
Do you think? I think we all feel that. We've seen presidential debates recently. When you think about that conversation, do you think we are still a society that could have that conversation? What does it require? Are we educated enough? I mean, candidly, one of the things that I find so interesting, we had Finfluencers up here earlier, Kyla Scanlon and Jack Farley, speaking about how they interact with their audience in terms of either long form or short form content, et cetera. I can't imagine the Federalist Papers being written or read today. Is there
unless written by ChatGPT?
Exactly. Well, we were talking about this when we were in the background.
Yeah, I mean, things have changed so much. Just one example that's so striking to me. So I was doing research on Southern secession, and in Georgia, when they were having the secession debates, the way that would work is somebody would stand up and read into a megaphone a 2-hour speech. And then the opponent would come back the next day and give the counter point by point through a megaphone of a 2-hour speech. And hundreds or I think maybe thousands of people are just standing there in rapt silence listening to this over several days.
They weren't distracted by their iPhones.
No,
Yeah, and the Lincoln Douglas debates were like that. They were like 3-hour speeches, and it was like multiple days. Yeah, totally.
and
different
when you read
concentration
the
of-
speeches that the people are doing in secession, you wouldn't believe it. Complex decision trees debating over what would be the counterfactual if we didn't, what would be the factual, how would Lincoln respond to this, that, and the other. It was hyper rational, hyper detailed, and stunning. From the perspective of today, and I think you may have been joking about the iPhone,
Yeah.
but I think you're onto something.
No, I'm joking about the iPhone from a technology, but I absolutely think that we are all incredibly distracted by these components. You're starting to see, I spend a lot of time, we're here for an educational institution, and one of the things I'm starting to see is a growing awareness of the cost of that distraction on kids. You're starting to see iPhones and phones in general taken away in the classroom. I don't know what the policy is at John Jay.
Oh yeah, no technology. I'm hardcore about that, and it's catching on with my colleagues. But yeah, and at first the kids are like, "What? How could that be?" I'm like, "Yeah, well, you need to go to another class. If you must have your device, if you can't use a pen and paper and be here, then there are other classes to take." And I think people feel relief actually to be away from these devices. But yeah,
Exactly.
What was your policy at Columbia?
Oh, I think I kind of had given up on it. We did have a policy that you're not supposed to be distracting the people next to you, and you're
You
supposed
can
to be
distract
engaged.
yourself as much as you want.
But yeah, I didn't really. Well, let me put it another way. I'm such an enthralling lecturer that I don't need.
I'll vouch for that.
there you go. I think we could have a more sophisticated discussion about reindustrialization, about changing our economy. I think that people are actually hungry, that the flip side of being distracted and uninformed is that people are actually not just intimidated, but they're very hungry for ideas and for the life of the mind. And if given the opportunity, frequently people rise to it. And so I think, just bit by bit, we could definitely have that. And that patriotism and the kind of base solidarity of like this place, this country, we as a people, that can be tapped into. That a lot of the psychological problems young people have these days have to do with the lack of meaning, right? And it's like, no, like we have a mission. This country's always had a mission. We have a mission now to turn back from deindustrialization and mistaking finance, which is important and powerful, for the entire economy. And this is going to be a long process, and it's going to need everyone to take what they do and how they live their lives and their skills seriously. I think that a lot of young people would love that that would be a call out of the boredom and silliness of the iPhone back into history. It's like, hey, your generation also has a mission.
My colleague at Columbia, Ned Phelps, wrote a book called Mass Flourishing. I don't know if you saw it, but he's a Nobel laureate in economics who actually has been trying to get at this same topic. And what he's noticed in that book is that the experience of being a worker in terms of how much creativity you are contributing to the workplace is very little now. And that most of our creative process is very concentrated in places like Silicon Valley, whereas it didn't used to be that way. Learning by doing. In fact, somebody here is going to know the Japanese word I'm trying to remember, which is basically continuous improvement.
Kanban, kind of stuff.
And so the point of that is that and I visited a Japanese factory, I'm guessing many of you have, and saw the way that was put into sort of action. Now, of course, I'm not saying that there's a panacea there, but I do think that you're onto something when you're talking about trying to approach this as a very general problem and take stock of where we are in terms of the meaningfulness of work. And I don't know the answer. I'm just an economist. But
well, one of the things I remember from the 1990s, right? So soon after I graduated from Penn and originally began working in various forms of corporate finance, were the discussions around restructuring in that time period and the attempts to move towards both the Malcolm Baldrige Award, right, the quality components of Japanese, et cetera. But much more important, I would argue, was this process that said, we want you to get rid of your own job, right? And you won't lose your job if you do that, right? We'll have these effectively work councils to offer continuous type improvement. Now that, of course, then ran into Chainsaw Al Dunlap and the far less kind restructuring cycles that we saw over that time period. Is it possible to get that back? Do you think that the desire is there as the longshoremen are on strike on the East Coast?
Well, I think the longshoremen, if I could jump in here, I think that's a great example, right? I mean, one thing also to keep in mind here is the demographic transition that really most of the world is going through, of aging populations. People are not having children at the same rate they used to, and so there is increasingly going to be a shortage of labor, right? So we need automation, and those are the conditions when possibly you could imagine a deal for the longshoremen that's realistic, where it's like, well, we're going to bring in automation, but you're going to make more money. We're going to deal you in. You're going to have more free time. And like put this in the context of the fact that pronatalist policies around the world work a little, but not really that much, right? And so there's increasingly a shortage of young people. That spells economic disaster. I mean, who will change the bedpans in the geriatric wards, quite literally? Who will pay the taxes, right? We need workers. So we're not going to have an enormous baby boom anytime soon. So productivity has to increase. Automation can be part of that. Workers have to be dealt in with higher wages, more flexibility. And I think that, the reskilling and kind of the room for creativity is an important part of that. And it runs in the face of a lot of what management wants to do, which of course, is control workers and control the process and see the process and gather information. But I mean, these are big questions, but I don't think they're undoable, or impossible.
The thing is, the government is frankly not good at doing anything, pretty much. Or let me say it a different way. Charles Lindblom, who was my professor when I was undergraduate, he was a political scientist and economist at Yale, he said, think of your hand. The government is the thumb. It's good at pushing, and the market are the fingers. And so the government's good at some things, but training people for the next generation is not one of them. Sometimes, just now, really make trouble. Sometimes I've thought, I wonder if it would be useful to let businesses enforce specific performance long-term contracts as part of training. So, we've outlawed, for no good reason, indentured servitude. Yeah. But, if you thought, allow businesses to sign you up for 4 or 5 years and you don't get to go away. That's not our current law, but that might actually be a really...
I've got a son who's at the U.S. Naval Academy.
Well, they have the monopoly.
They have the monopoly on the indentured servitude for 5 years, right?
Yes.
And it works reasonably well. And
so I feel like that, we have to start. That idea is not going to fly in America today, probably. But I do think that when framed that way, why should the military have the monopoly? Why shouldn't other businesses be able to sign contracts like that?
To ensure that they effectively get a return on the investment that they make in education.
You don't want to train people for your competitors.
You can imagine how it would be legal, I think, right? Where say this is free if you then work for us for 5 years. If you don't, then it's you're going to have to pay the tuition of the training. You guys as educators are speaking right to one of the areas that I think is so important, because we've adopted universally funded tertiary education that by definition is generalist in nature and offers, in every piece of research I've ever seen, offers no discernible impact on productivity whatsoever, right? Whereas the internship process that you're describing would flow straight through. It would have its own challenges associated with it, but it would start to address the process of why don't businesses invest in their employees as they used to. Yeah.
I'd like to open it up for a few minutes of questions. I'm sure there has to be at least one question from the audience. Anyone raise their hand? All right, Charlie, over there.
My question is capitalism itself, in its sort of as free market as possible, kind of libertarian configuration, just not up to the job of reindustrialization? I think of capitalism as like this incredibly good local optimizer. It's good at like a local step change, but to find a local...
Make the transition, yes.
It's terrible at longer horizon step change improvements. You say the government's bad at stuff, but we built the atomic bomb in 4 years.
Right.
It's all like it, right?
Right.
And it was like, 1,000 flowers of technicalization moved after that. So I question the premise that the market can take care of it. And as a follow-on subset of that, in particular funding innovation in America, the venture capital market not really built at all for industrial innovation, right? It's only built for low marginal cost, software, natural monopoly, everybody wants to be a platform. Anything that's capital intensive and internally high ROI, but like asset intensive, is like dead to everything you see in Silicon Valley. So can you comment a little bit about how the structured market might need to change and what the role of government should be to get out of the local optimization game into the global optimization game?
Well, we've seen, I have an open mind about these things, and I think the Lindblom fingers and thumb is the right way to think about this. At the same time, I'm kind of tired of academics who don't know much about the Marshall Plan saying, we need a Marshall Plan. Doesn't that make you crazy? Every problem, we need a Marshall Plan. Okay, and it was an example of fingers, the market, working in Europe with the thumb coming from the US government. I just, I'm not sure that how to structure that, but I have an open mind. I wish I had an intelligent answer to your question. But I do want to suggest that we remember, as my friend Deirdre McCloskey says, she wishes that we stopped using the word capitalism and instead use the more accurate word to describe this system, which is innovism. Because, we had a hockey stick change in wealth or income per capita that happened around the middle of the 19th century, and there's no turning back. Nobody, Karl Marx, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, none of them would have believed that you could have a permanent increase in per capita income. That was something that was unthinkable in 1850, and we take it for granted. So the government didn't do that. So we have to find solutions. I don't have a good one to offer. I wish I did.
I think that the truth about American capitalism is that it was never the libertarian image, and it's not now, right? Since 2008, basically all funding of student loans is by the government, right? And we don't acknowledge that, we basically socialized a large part of tuition, right? Maybe we could do something better with that. Maybe we should make tuition free and give that money to universities with, certain stipulations. We want you to focus on this, that, whatever. And it's the combination of private industry and government support. Not that always works, right? Throwing money at the problem doesn't always work, but the railroads, the Erie Canal, the way those worked was that the government gave subsidized cheap credit and land to the railroads and the canal companies, and then private firms built those, and with every mile of track, they got more land, and they then developed that land, and that's really where the profits came from for the railroad companies.
I agree with you.
I think there's a lot of examples of this, mixed economy, essentially, that we have, but we're in denial about.
But, the problem is, and then after the Erie Canal, all these states thought they could imitate it. They spent huge amounts of money and went broke.
Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, speaking of broke, we broke the clock. We are past our time. This was an absolute pleasure. Charles, thank you so much.
Oh, such
really
a pleasure.
Great to see you again. Christian.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this so much.